Poor girl rescues twins. Never imagined they belonged to a millionaire. Sarah Miller, just 22 years old, pushed open the heavy glass door of the diner where she had spent another exhausting evening serving coffee, refilling cups, and carrying plates heavier than her arms could manage, her apron stained with the scent of fried food, clinging to her clothes as she stepped into the cool Texas night. The streets were quiet, the neon lights buzzing faintly as she walked down the familiar path that led toward her tiny rented apartment, her shoes scuffing against the cracked pavement, her breath steady after a long shift, but her mind replaying every tip she had earned, calculating whether it would cover rent and groceries this week. She turned onto the back road, the one she usually avoided because it was dimly lit, but tonight her legs felt too tired to take the longer route, and so she cut behind the grocery store, hugging her jacket tightly as the smell of old cardboard and discarded vegetables drifted through the air. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of a distant street lamp, until suddenly she froze, her ears catching a faint sound. Soft, almost like a kitten, a muffled whimper that seemed to echo off the brick walls of the narrow alley. Her heart skipped a beat as she paused, straining to listen. And there it was again, clearer this time, a small cry that carried both fear and helplessness, pulling at her instincts before her mind had even processed what it could mean. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes adjusting to the shadows, scanning the piles of boxes stacked near the dumpster. And then, in the corner, her gaze landed on something that made her gasp aloud. A battered cardboard box, tucked against the wall, trembling faintly as the sound of whimpers rose from within. Her pulse quickened, dread mixing with disbelief, as she crouched down a her and pushed aside the flaps of the box, her breath catching in her throat when her eyes fell on the sight before her. Two tiny babies, barely a year old, their cheeks flushed from the cold night air, were curled together under thin, worn-out blankets that looked more like rags than anything meant to keep a child warm. Their little fists clenched as they whimpered softly, their eyes half closed, as if fighting against exhaustion. Sarah's entire world seemed to stop in that moment. The exhaustion from her shift vanished, replaced by a rush of shock, protectiveness, and sorrow so strong it almost brought tears to her eyes as she whispered instinctively, her voice trembling, "Oh, sweethearts, who would leave you like this?" She felt the sting of tears forming as she carefully reached into the box, her hands shaking but gentle, sliding one arm beneath the fragile body of the first child and then the other, lifting them both into her chest, cradling them as if they had always belonged there. The warmth of their tiny bodies seeped into her, and she could feel the rapid beat of their hearts against her skin, fragile yet alive, desperate for comfort, desperate for someone to claim them. Sarah held them close, shielding them from the night air, rocking slightly as though her body already knew what they needed, her mind racing with questions, but her heart anchored firmly in the present moment. She glanced around the alley, searching for any sign of the person who could have left them, but there was no movement, no footsteps fading into the distance, no hurried figure disappearing into the night, just emptiness, silence, and two abandoned souls in her arms. The smell of cardboard and damp cement surrounded her, but all she could focus on was the softness of their cheeks pressed against her shoulder, the tiny whimpers quieting as they felt her warmth, their breaths shallow but slowly, steadying as though they sensed safety for the first time that night. 1,000 thoughts flashed through her mind. Should she call the police? Should she run to the hospital? Should she scream for help? But none of them mattered in that second, because all she could do was hold them tighter, rocking them as her tears slipped silently down her face, dripping onto the blanket that barely covered their fragile bodies. The alley suddenly didn't feel so dark, because within her arms was a fragile light, a responsibility she never expected, but one she could not turn away from. Her chest ached as she thought of the cruelty of whoever had abandoned them, leaving them to the mercy of the cold and the silence. But at the same time, her soul stirred with a strange new strength, as though fate had placed her in that alley at that exact moment for a reason. She pressed her cheek gently against the soft curls of one twin, inhaling the faint scent of milk and dust, whispering promises she wasn't even sure she could keep, but promises nonetheless, that they would not be alone tonight, not as long as she had arms to carry them. Her legs trembled as she stood, balancing the weight of both children against her chest, but the weight felt less like a burden and more like a calling. Her tired body suddenly fueled with purpose as she stepped out of the alley and back onto the quiet street. The neon lights of the diner flickered in the distance, but all she could see was the fragile hope resting in her arms, two lives abandoned yet not lost, because she had found them, because she had chosen to stop, to listen, to care. Sarah pushed open the creaky door to her studio apartment, the hinges groaning, as if even the metal understood how cramped and weary her life had become. And she carefully shifted the twins against her chest, whispering soothing sounds to keep them from stirring too much as she stepped inside. The space was barely large enough for her own needs, a single window letting in the faint glow of the streetlight, a sagging couch pushed against one wall, a tiny bed squeezed into the other, and a small kitchenette cluttered with second-hand dishes she had picked up from thrift stores over the years. She set the twins down gently on her bed, tucking the thin blanket around them, and for a moment she just stood there, staring at their peaceful faces, feeling the odd mix of fear and responsibility settle heavier than any tray of food she had ever carried at the diner. That night she rummaged through her fridge, finding only leftover fries and a half-empty carton of milk. And while her stomach ached with hunger, she poured the milk into a small cup, warming it over the stove before soaking bread to mash into a soft mixture the babies could swallow, improvising because she had nothing better. As she fed them carefully, one after the other, watching their little mouths open hungrily, she felt her heart break and mend at the same time, her exhaustion battling against a sense of purpose that kept her upright even though her eyes longed for sleep. Days turned into a blur of long shifts at the diner, the bell above the door ringing constantly as she balanced trays, wiped tables, and smiled at customers while silently worrying about whether she had enough money for diapers and formula. On more than one occasion, she placed a tip she had just received straight into the cashier's hand at the drugstore down the street, buying baby wipes and powdered formula, while telling herself she could manage one less meal for herself if it meant the twins would not go hungry. At night, when her feet ached and her hands were red from scrubbing dishes, she would slip off her shoes, sit cross-legged on the floor beside the bed, and rock the twins one by one in her arms, humming softly in a voice so tender that it surprised even her, whispering word, as she hadn't said out loud to anyone in years. "I don't know where you came from, but you're safe now. You're mine to protect." Her neighbors whispered when they saw her carrying the twins down the hallway, their voices sharp and judgmental. "She can't even pay her rent. What is she doing with two babies?" But Sarah only held her head a little higher, refusing to let their opinions cut deeper than the truth she carried in her chest, the truth that love mattered more than money. The nights were the hardest, the kind where her stomach growled louder than the ceiling fan rattling above her, when she pulled the blanket around herself on the couch because she had given the bed entirely to the babies, when she pressed her eyes shut tight and prayed that tomorrow's double shift would earn just enough to stretch through the week. She learned to survive on little scraps, nibbling at leftover cornbread or sipping lukewarm coffee from the diner, her strength fueled not by food, but by the tiny giggles she sometimes heard in the morning, the small hands that gripped her fingers with surprising force, the wide eyes that followed her around the room as if she were the most important person in the world. On Sundays, her only half-day off, she would bundle the twins into borrowed baby clothes from a thrift shop, walking them in a stroller an elderly neighbor had given her out of pity, and though she felt the sting of being judged, she also felt proud, as though the world should know she was trying, that she was giving her all to two children who had been given nothing. Sometimes, when the lights were out and the apartment was silent except for the sound of two steady breaths, she would sit on the edge of the bed, watching them sleep, and wonder how long she could keep this up, if her body could handle the constant work and sacrifice. But then one of the twins would stir, reaching out blindly until their little hand rested against her arm, And in that moment, every doubt melted into determination. Friends at the Yoltane diner shook their heads at her choices, telling her between shifts, "Sarah, you're crazy. This isn't your responsibility. You can barely take care of yourself." But she only smiled softly, her tired eyes shining with a light they had never seen before, replying in a quiet voice, "Maybe not. But they need me, and that's enough." And so the days went on, hard and unrelenting, but with every bottle she warmed, every diaper she changed, every lullaby whispered into the night, Sarah built a love so fierce it made the walls of her small apartment glow with a warmth money could never buy. In Dallas, the city lights glittered against the night sky, reflecting off towering skyscrapers, but for David Anderson, a man of 38, whose face had grown sharper with years of silent grief, the brightness outside only deepened the shadows within his mansion, a sprawling estate that looked magnificent to strangers, yet suffocating to the man who walked its silent halls. Each polished marble floor, each chandelier sparkling above him, only reminded him of what he no longer had: laughter, warmth, family. He had once been a young husband filled with dreams, standing proudly beside his wife as they prepared for the birth of their twins, their first children, their greatest joy. But that joy was shattered before it could begin. The hospital fire and the chaos that followed stole what should have been the happiest day of his life, leaving him with unanswered questions, a broken heart, and a wife who slowly faded beneath the weight of sorrow she could not bear. He remembered holding her hand during sleepless nights, whispering empty reassurances that one day they would find their babies. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months with no answers, her hope wilted, her smile disappeared, and eventually so did her heartbeat, leaving him utterly alone. The empire he built afterward was born not out of ambition, but out of desperation, as though stacking bricks of success could cover the cracks inside his chest. But every award, every business deal, his mansion became his cage, each room filled with silence so heavy that he sometimes turned on the television just to hear another voice, only to mute it minutes later when the sound felt meaningless. At night, he often sat in his study, surrounded by books he never read, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating on the desk, while he stared at the faded photograph of his wife, her smile frozen in time, and beside her, the empty space where their children should have been. He had hired detectives, spent fortunes chasing leads across states and even countries, clinging to rumors, false sightings, and empty promises, until each disappointment carved deeper lines into his face, and eventually, even the investigators told him gently, "Mr. Anderson, maybe it's time to let go." But how could a father let go of children he never even had the chance to hold? The world admired him for his wealth, for his sharp mind, for the skyscrapers his company funded, but behind closed doors he was a man fractured. A man who ate alone at a long dining table, a man who sometimes stood outside the nursery that had been prepared years ago, its walls still painted pale blue, the crib untouched, a haunting reminder of a future stolen. Friends and colleagues encouraged him to remarry, to start over, but he dismissed them with a curt shake of his head, unable to imagine love with anyone else when his heart remained buried with the woman he had lost. Time passed, and though the sharp sting of grief dulled into a constant ache, he never stopped wondering, were his children alive somewhere, growing up without him, or had fate taken them forever? He kept their birth certificates locked in a drawer, occasionally pulling them out, tracing his finger over the printed names, whispering to himself that they were real, that they had existed, even if the world tried to erase them from his story. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep refused to come, he found himself driving aimlessly through neighborhoods, slowing down when he saw children playing in yards, imagining for a fleeting second that one of them might be his before the cruel reality yanked him back. His wealth became meaningless trophies in a game he no longer cared to play, his reputation as a brilliant businessman a mask that hid a hollow soul, because beneath the tailored suits and expensive watches was simply a father in mourning. Even in boardrooms during important meetings, he often caught himself drifting, hearing phantom echoes of infant cries or the soft lullabies his wife used to hum, sounds that had no place in his present but clung stubbornly to his memory. The mansion staff tiptoed around him, aware that their employer carried a sadness deeper than words, and though he treated them kindly, he rarely spoke more than a few sentences a day, preferring solitude to false cheer. Holidays were the worst. Christmas trees stood tall in his living room, decorated by hired designers, but to him they were just ornaments on branches, empty symbols of joy he could not feel. On his birthday each year, he sat alone, declining invitations, staring instead at two tiny, unopened gifts he had bought long ago, wrapped for children who never came home, still sitting on the shelf untouched. Over time, he told himself he had to stop searching, that hope was a wound refusing to close, and yet, deep in his chest, a quiet ember of faith refused to die, flickering faintly even when he tried to smother it with reason. He did not know that fate, patient and merciless, had been arranging threads in the background, weaving a reunion he could not yet imagine, a collision of past and present that would shake the very foundations of his grief. But for now, David Anderson remained a man haunted, waiting unknowingly for the day destiny would knock at his door. The days in Sarah's small Texas town blended together, each one marked by work, sacrifice, and the quiet joy of watching the twins grow a little stronger under her care, until one bright Saturday afternoon, when the sun cast golden light across the park's open field, she decided to take them outside for a change, pushing their old stroller along the sidewalk, humming softly as the children kicked their legs excitedly. The park was alive with laughter and movement, children running after kites, parents chatting on benches, the smell of grilled food drifting from a nearby vendor. And for Sarah, it felt like a brief escape from the walls of her tiny apartment, a chance to breathe in fresh air while the twins giggled at the sight of squirrels darting across the grass. She spread out a faded blanket under a shady oak tree, letting the twins crawl and tumble onto the grass, their laughter carrying like tiny bells, filling her chest with a warmth that made her forget, just for a moment, how little she had. Strangers passing by smiled at the sight of her with the children, some assuming they were her own, and though Sarah knew the truth, she didn't correct them because in her heart, that's exactly how it felt. She leaned back against the tree, closing her eyes briefly when the low hum of an expensive engine drew her attention, a sleek black car gliding into a nearby parking spot, its polished surface gleaming under the sun. The door opened, and from it stepped a man in a tailored suit, tall, broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding even in a casual park. Sarah didn't recognize him, but the moment his gaze fell upon the twins, something inside him shifted, his steps slowing, his breath catching as though he had seen ghosts brought to life. David Anderson, who had carried years of emptiness in his chest, suddenly felt his heart hammer against his ribs, because in the faces of those laughing children he saw more than innocence. He saw his wife's smile reflected perfectly, her dimple, her softness, alive in their tiny mouths. And when the boy turned his head, the sunlight caught the unmistakable hazel glint in his eyes, the exact mirror of David's own. His knees nearly gave beneath him as a wave of recognition he couldn't explain washed over him, an ache of familiarity too powerful to dismiss as coincidence, and for the first time in years he felt the impossible tug of hope. He found himself walking closer, each step careful, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path, not wanting to frighten the young woman sitting with them, yet unable to stop himself from drawing nearer. Sarah noticed him immediately, instinctively pulling the twins closer as they crawled back toward her, her protective instinct sharp and fierce, her arms wrapping around them as her eyes flicked warily to the stranger. David stopped a respectful distance away, his voice hesitant, almost trembling as he spoke. "Excuse me, these twins, are they yours?" The question hung heavy between them, laced with a desperation he didn't mean to reveal, but Sarah heard it, felt the weight of something she didn't understand. She hesitated, tightening her hold on the children, her voice steady but tinged with defiance as she answered, No one else wanted them, so yes, they're mine. Her words struck David like a blow and a balm at the same time. He heard the fierce claim of love in her tone, the way she had made them hers, but inside him another voice whispered, could it be? Could fate truly be this cruel and this merciful all at once? He studied her face briefly, then returned his gaze to the twins, every detail pulling him deeper into the storm of memory and longing. His mind screaming questions he dared not ask yet. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, sensing his intense stare, unsure whether to trust this stranger in a suit whose presence felt so out of place in her world, while David fought to steady his breath, forcing himself not to blurt out the truth his heart already suspected. The park continued around them as though nothing had changed, children shouting, a dog barking, laughter echoing, but for Sarah and David, the world had narrowed to that single moment, a fragile crossroads where past and present quietly collided, and in the silence after her answer, destiny took its first visible step forward. David walked away from the park that day with a storm raging inside him, the laughter of the twins echoing in his mind long after the black car had carried him back to his mansion. And though he tried to focus on business calls, meetings, and the endless tasks that filled his calendar, his thoughts kept circling back to those children with hazel eyes and smiles that stirred memories buried in grief. That night he sat alone in his study, staring at a photograph of his late wife holding the newborns in the hospital, the last picture he had before the nightmare of their disappearance. And he felt the same ache of helplessness, but this time there was also a fragile spark of hope urging him to act. He knew he couldn't trust coincidence, and he couldn't allow desperation to cloud his judgment, so he resolved to confirm what his heart was screaming, and that meant reaching out to Sarah with honesty. The next day he found himself at her modest apartment door, holding himself with unusual humility for a man of his stature. And when she opened it, the twins clinging to her skirt, she looked at him with suspicion. His voice was steady but vulnerable as he explained, I need to know the truth, and I can't do it without your help. Will you let me take a DNA test? Sarah's chest tightened at the request, torn between fear and a strange pull of compassion in his eyes. And though her instinct screamed to protect the children from everything unknown, something in his sincerity softened her resistance. After a long pause, she agreed, setting one condition, that she would be present for everything, that there would be no secrets. Days later, at a quiet clinic far from prying eyes, swabs were taken gently from the twins, from David, and Sarah held them tightly on her lap, whispering comfort even as she tried to hide her own trembling. The wait for results felt like years compressed into days, each hour stretching into eternity for David, who hardly slept, who paced the halls of his mansion like a restless spirit, haunted by what might be confirmed or denied. Sarah too wrestled with her thoughts, asking herself who this man truly was and what his return into their lives would mean. Her greatest fear being that the babies she loved as her own would be taken from her arms. When the results finally arrived, the envelope trembled in David's hands as though it carried the weight of destiny itself, and with Sarah seated across from him, the twins playing innocently at their feet, he unfolded the papers and read. His breath caught, his hands shook, and tears welled in his eyes as the words burned into his soul. The children were his long-lost twins, flesh of his flesh, the very ones he had believed stolen forever. For a moment he couldn't speak, the sound of his own sob choking him, until finally he whispered through tears, "There, my twins. I lost them years ago. I can't believe they're alive." Sarah's heart pounded like a drum, fear surging through her chest as she stared at him, wondering if this revelation meant she was about to lose them, the only family she had built in her struggling world. Her lips trembled as she managed, "What does this mean for them? For me?" But instead of the cold claim she feared, David leaned forward, his eyes filled with gratitude and pain interwoven, and gently reached for her hand across the small table. His voice broke with sincerity as he said, "You saved them when the world abandoned them. You gave them love I couldn't. I don't want to take them from you. I want us to raise them together." The words left Sarah stunned, her body tense, her mind racing, but her heart heard the raw truth behind them, a promise she hadn't expected, and in that fragile moment of honesty, the first fragile bridge between grief and hope began to form. Sarah's eyes welled as David's words echoed in the quiet room, a promise she had never expected from a man whose world seemed galaxies away from hers. Yet in that moment, she felt something she had been starving for: acceptance. The twins giggled on the floor, unaware of the weight that had just lifted, their innocent joy reminding both Sarah and David that love was always greater than loss. David reached down, scooping one child into his arms, while Sarah lifted the other, and as the little ones stretched their hands across to touch both adults at once, it felt as though an invisible thread bound them all together. For years Sarah had carried the heavy burden of survival alone, but now she felt the strength of a partner beside her, someone who truly understood the meaning of family after years of emptiness. The laughter of the twins filled the air like music, the sound that once haunted David now becoming the very thing that healed him. In that embrace, Sarah no longer saw herself as the poor waitress who counted pennies, but as a mother whose love had rewritten destiny. Days turned into weeks, and their unusual bond grew into something natural, something unshakable, as Sarah and David navigated parenthood together. David insisted on helping with midnight feedings and diaper changes, tasks he had missed when grief stole his chance the first time, and Sarah was surprised to find him gentle, patient, and eager to learn. The twins thrived with the balance of Sarah's nurturing and David's devotion, their cheeks rounder, their laughter louder, their steps more confident as they toddled about. Sarah's small apartment soon felt too cramped, yet instead of whisking her away to his mansion immediately, David asked what she wanted, honoring her choices rather than imposing his world. She realized then that wealth did not define him as much as his humility and determination to be a present father. Slowly, Sarah began to trust that she wasn't just a temporary caretaker in their lives, but an irreplaceable part of their family's foundation. One Sunday morning, as sunlight streamed through thin curtains, David brewed coffee while Sarah fed the twins, and it struck her. This simple life, not the size of the house or the luxury of the furniture, was what made her heart full. Yet David, with his resources and heart renewed, promised to create a future where struggle would no longer steal her peace. And he did so, not by flaunting riches, but by offering stability. Together they began dreaming of a home where the twins could grow with love, education, and safety. But most importantly, laughter. Sarah often lay awake at night, watching the twins sleep between them, and whispered silent prayers of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought them together. David, too, found himself healed in ways he never thought possible, his mansion no longer a cold prison but a place alive with giggles, warmth, and the scent of home-cooked meals. Neighbors and friends who once pitied Sarah now admired her resilience, seeing how she had blossomed into the heart of a family rebuilt from ashes. She had not only given David back his children, but also reminded him what it meant to truly live. Sacrifices were still made. Sarah continued to work hard, though no longer alone, and David balanced business with bedtime stories, proving love mattered more than success. The twins grew stronger each day, their hazel eyes shining with the reflection of two parents who adored them beyond measure. As months passed, Sarah's confidence bloomed, and the fear of losing everything faded, replaced by the assurance that she was chosen, cherished, and needed. David often looked at her with gratitude, whispering, "You saved them, but you also saved me." Words that Sarah carried like a secret treasure in her heart. Together they stood not as two broken souls, but as one whole family, reborn from pain into joy, from loss into abundance. Sarah realized she no longer carried the label of poor girl, for she had discovered a wealth far greater than money, the wealth of unconditional love. And David, once a lonely man in a silent mansion, now found himself surrounded by laughter, hugs, and hope that stretched into tomorrow. On quiet evenings, they often walked in the park again, the same place where destiny had crossed their paths, watching the twins run in the grass, their small hands held by both parents. In those moments, Sarah knew her story had changed forever. The girl who once had nothing now had everything.